Very good. So an important report. It'll be completed over the next month or two, and then we're just trying to work out how we're going to officially launch it, which we think we'll do in Canberra, with a bit of fanfare and some politicians to get some benefit out of it. But it is a stake in the ground in the context of where the industry currently sits, and it has some views about where we need to go. It's great to have the data. The trick is how you actually use it and go and to greatest effect and go and do stuff. But research has been the foundation of the development of big policy from day one. We're a very evidence-based, focused organisation, and without the facts, without the truth, we don't really get very far with our members of parliament or bureaucrats. So the bus rapid transit report, also extremely important. Just need to actually keep pumping out there that the most flexible, cost-efficient and effective way to spend your money on public transport is on bus services. So I'm just going to do a quick wrap-up of the conference and the session before we move to our guest speaker, and a slight focus on where we'll be looking as an industry or BIC for 2019-20. And I think a lot of these things are really what we've been talking about over the last few days, and running into a federal election, it's extremely important that we actually make it clear to all of the political parties what our expectations are as an industry. Over the last decade, we've seen the federal government invest more money into public transport infrastructure than they have since Federation in 1901. So they're putting money into public transport. It's largely into large rail projects and light rail projects. There are some significant bus projects that the Speaker from Infrastructure Australia talked about, such as the Brisbane Metro, and there's the 3 BRTs which are being developed from Campbelltown, Penrith and Liverpool. So it's important to keep the pressure on in the context of that, but as I've just said, the other focus has to be future technology, whether it's the trackless tram, which is, the way to say a brand new bus that looks like a tram but on rubber wheels. It's bus rapid transit or bus priority. We sort of see bus priority as the low-hanging fruit that the federal government needs to focus on and support state governments to actually invest in these things. But as you heard from Infrastructure Australia, as I said, they're very focused on the future as bus is the better way to go in the context of future public transport. From a regional perspective, having a strong focus on regional connectivity and accessibility, and that's between village, town and regional centre and city, and trying to engage the federal and state governments to try and get those connections right. At the same time, looking at what the opportunities are in those low volume markets for the bus sector to actually expand its businesses. I think the area that really, I guess, seems to have the most hope from an industry perspective in getting federal government involvement is through the city deals and the city partnerships. The Labor government, if they win the election, will call it Sydney Partnerships. If the coalition win, they'll call it City Deals. But because it's pulling together local, state and federal government together, all of a sudden there's actually a much greater focus on planning and integrated transport and getting agreements across the board about how each level of government needs to invest in public transport, and hence the whole outcome in that Aeropolis or the Western Sydney City Deal, which I just mentioned, where they actually had to think seriously about how they integrated all of those local councils, what the state government role was and what the federal government role was. And in order to get the federal government's money to build the airport, they've had to come to the state and local governments have had to come to the party and invest in public transport to link to that airport. So these things are an important part of it. We heard from the federal department about the city's performance framework, which has clear performance indicators that they want to measure state governments against in relation to how their public transport network works. And that's critical because all of a sudden they can decide where it's not working, and that's where the funding appropriately can go. But those performance indicators, which are benchmarking state government's performance, is important because this whole concept of value for money starts to become a real thing, where the bus industry, when it comes to value for money, is clearly the most cost-effective and efficient way to do it, and flexible. The whole concept of city deals means nothing if we don't have regional deals, and that'll be a focus as well over the next 12 months. And I can see that naturally emerging out of the city deals as it is, and it already is actually. They're doing Launceston deal, they're doing a Cairns deal shortly, they're doing a Geelong deal. They're already doing regional deals. They're just calling them city deals because a city is any city that's over 80,000 people. Everyone seems to think it's about Sydney, but these deals are important. And ultimately the regional deals, I think, and for a lot of people weren't in the last session yesterday afternoon, which is about local government's role in all of this, which is the greatest probably opportunity for industry to actually work more closely with local councils to actually identify where there are missing links in existing services, where new developments are going, how they actually work with local government to ensure that the services are planned before the development's built, without providing access for buses or garbage trucks as they tend to do. So all of this is on the agenda for us. APDIA and industrial relations challenges. We heard from Macca in relation to the whole Skeen case and what's going to be happening in the casual employment area, which could provide big challenges to industry, but APDIA and through Macca and the state associations will be working closely on that. I guess the two other big areas which will be seeing some policy development is in the long distance tour and charter policy space, and you heard Anthony Albanese mention that yesterday in his presentation, where he mentioned the whole concept of a national land transport tourism plan and actually looking at ways we can encourage people to travel across Australia rather than fly over it. And we've distributed that document to each of the political parties. That'll be a focus over the next decade, because that has set a 10-year aspiration to increase patronage on coaches by domestic and international travellers by 2 to 3% respectively. So important, and an area we haven't previously necessarily been involved, but last year ran a school bus summit, or a travel to learn and school bus summit. We're developing a policy statement that looks at where school bus fits in the context of mainstream transport. So a lot going on. There's a whole range of specifics. I guess my view from this conference is that this industry is a growth industry. Some of those statistics are actually quite telling when you see that we're only carrying 4 to 6% of, or undertaking 4 to 6% of the trips that are taking place across the country, both in our cities and regions, and that 80%, for example, of people are still travelling by cars. Now, the opportunity is there to increase that those patronage numbers. A lot of this discussions have been about future mobility and how we improve the customer service experience, whether mobility as a service is going to be a reality, where autonomous vehicles fit. As I say, I'm 50-50. There'll be something that'll change, but it won't be 100% where everything's autonomous and everything's wonderful and everyone's happy. And buses will have an ongoing role. There's no doubt about that. So I might leave it at that. I'll just wrap up a few things after our guest speaker, but we might move on to asking James Lowe from McConnell Seats to introduce our guest speaker today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.